What I prefer is to use this definition of branding. Your brand is what your customers believe about you. Your brand is what your customers believe about you. Now, what's important about this is there's often a big disconnect between the image we project to the world and what customers believe about us. We all know this is true, don't we? I was working on this presentation with one of my associates, Amanda, last week, and she'd just been to Alaska. And so she gets in the Delta plane with her husband leaving Anchorage. This guy, Richard Anderson, the CEO of Delta, comes on a video, and in the video he's sitting in a plush chair in his office, and he's giving this talk to welcome the people on the Delta flight, and he says, "Sit back and relax." Well, Amanda's sitting there with her husband crammed like sardines, and her seat didn't lean back, okay? We know that a lot. There's a disconnect between what we say to customers and what they actually perceive. Remember this guy, the Verizon guy? Can you hear me now? Became just part of our cultural vernacular. The commercials went like this. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Now, the rational part of our brain, we can say, we can imagine ourselves in the creative meetings, and we know what the Verizon folks were thinking and their agencies. By doing that, we're going to show we have service here and here and here. You can just imagine ubiquity of service being in some PowerPoint in the boardroom there, right? But what's our mental model of somebody saying, can you hear me? Walking, can you hear me? Our mental model is that means you didn't have service there. And when those ads were running, I asked a lot of workshop participants, what do you think is going on here? And they said, Verizon service is spotty. Big disconnect from what they intended to communicate and what people perceived. And this leads us to fundamental marketing truth number 3. Your brand is not what you say you are. Your brand is what your customers think you are. Now, this may seem like, okay, what does it mean? What's the practical application? Well, the practical application is we need to close that gap between what we are saying and what our customers are believing. The first part of closing that gap is to recognize there is a gap. I consult in lots of different industries. On purpose, I like to work with large companies, small, consumer, B2B, for-profit, not-for-profit, manufacturing, service. And what I see in all these organizations is something really interesting. If I ask the executives, what do your customers think about you, and then we do research to find out what the customers actually think, I don't think I've ever seen it be the same. And it couldn't be the same because within the company, there isn't one idea of what customers think. Usually there's a lot of differences, and it's based on myths. We all have myths in our company about what our customers think about us, don't we? And usually we generalize too much. It's usually vague. Customers have much more nuanced impressions of us than we think. I have a friend who is a wonderful author of spiritual books. Her name's Karen Kadar, and she told me this wonderfully fascinating comment once that she heard from her high school English teacher. The teacher said, there are 3 poems in every poem. The poem that the poet intended to write, the poem that actually ends up on paper, and the poem that the reader perceives. Isn't that fascinating? The poem the poet intended to write, what we think about is going to happen when we want to do our marketing efforts. The poem that ends up on paper, what the marketing effort actually ends up as. When senior management micromanages it and changes things and somebody doesn't do something right. And then the poem the reader perceives is the perception the customer has. This is incredibly important. Your brand is not what you say you are. Your brand is what your customers think you are.